So this video is going to talk about notices of intended prosecution. So in this video, we're going to talk about the notice of intended prosecution. There's lots of information on the internet about this, and indeed there's plenty of urban myths as well. Many people have heard this concept that if you're not notified of intended prosecution within 14 days of the date of the offence, then you can't be prosecuted at all. But it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. There's more to it. So hopefully I can bust some of those myths around this. I'm not going to cover every possible outcome, but hopefully we'll give you an overview so that it's better understood. Now, notice of intended prosecution actually comes from Section 1 of the Road Traffic Offenders Act. Now, that all sounds a bit technical, but all that section says is that for certain offences, the most common being speeding, or it could be careless driving, before you being prosecuted, and we're talking about a speed awareness course, a fixed penalty notice, a summons to appear before the magistrate's court, the police must warn you that that might happen within 14 days. Now, in the case of being pulled over by a police officer at the side of the road or having a physical interaction, that notice of intended prosecution might take the form of a verbal notice of intended prosecution, whereby at the end of it, the officer says to you, you will now be reported for summons or for consideration of prosecution. The notice of intended prosecution is given at that stage. You may not necessarily receive anything through the post. So that's dealt with at that point. Now, in the most common of cases, where you might be unlucky enough to go through a speed camera, I certainly know I've done that myself, you'll receive a notice of intended prosecution through the post. And that will often be combined with a request for driver information, because quite often the camera will not tell the police who was driving the car. It will simply tell them that the person driving the car has potentially committed that offence. Now, in those cases, you have to receive that notice of intended prosecution within 14 days, or certainly it's got to be sent out by the police in a fashion where you should receive it within that 14-day period. So that is in fact our notice of intended prosecution. It doesn't apply to all offences, but the main ones it applies to, the ones that will probably impact upon you most of all, are those offences such as speeding and careless driving. Is it a miracle? Is it the way out of your case? Well, I have to say, in most cases, the police put into effect the notice of intended prosecution in good time and properly. However, there are sometimes those cases where the police will fall foul. Now, I have to say, sometimes I'll receive telephone calls from inquiries, and they'll ask the question, I think I've been flashed by a speed camera. Have I been caught? Am I going to be prosecuted? Now, what I tend to say to people in those circumstances is that if it has happened, I can't tell you if it's happened, but if it has happened, then you should receive that notice within 14 days. Now, it is slightly more complicated than that. I'm not performing a law lecture here, but hopefully the information's helpful. But if you have other questions, go on the internet, speak to a lawyer, ring Caddick Davis. We'll always try and answer your question for you. Hopefully today's episode has been helpful and it's answered some of the questions that you may have had. If it has been helpful, please share it to your network. And if you haven't done so already, please like, subscribe, and press for your notifications so you hear about future episodes.